It's time for your weekly dose furries, as we've got some great nature reveals.
Stand up! Vanguard!
Hey Cardfighters, welcome back to another Cardfight update, and today we've got some new great nature reveals for VBT11 Storm of the Blue Cavalry. As you probably already know, this set will contain two different VRs for great nature, and either of those VRs are going to have a different spin on what the clan is going to do. And one of those is Isabelle, which will focus, of course, on the whole lottery mechanic, and incidentally, that particular VR, as well as two supporting cards, was revealed today. So without any further ado, let's jump straight into these cards and see what this new support for great nature will mean for the clan as a whole, and what type of direction the clan can take in this new evolving landscape. So of course, all of these cards are going to have a lottery mechanic, and we're going to start off with a new grade 1 for great nature, and that is going to be Besom Ring Till. And its ability is Auto Rigor Circle. When it attacks or boosts, costs counter plus 1, put the top card of your deck into the drop zone and perform one of the effects below depending on the card's type. Normal unit, draw a card. Trigger unit, choose one of your opponent's rear guards, retire it, and this unit gets power plus 5 until the end of turn. So this card is very similar to the old Binoculus and Monoculus Tiger cards, as Monoculus Tiger was a grade 1 that used its ability on attack or boost, similar like this grade 1, but its skill is very similar to Binoculus Tiger, which is a very strong grade 2 card. It's the same cost, and it has almost the same effect. The only difference here is that this card, if you hit a trigger unit, only gives itself 5k power, and Binoculus Tiger would give 3 units plus 5k power. So, of course, that's a little bit better, but that's on a grade 2, so that's not that weird to see for this grade 1. And because this card can be used a bit sooner, and in combination with other cards, it can also be a great booster for any attack. So overall, this is a really nice grade 1 for great nature, as so far the lottery mechanic grade 1s were a bit iffy in most cases. Like the grade 1 that we got last year with Isabelle isn't really that great, and Monoculus Tiger is a really good card, but also very situational. This is just a solid grade 1 for any type of build in any situation. So this is a really good, nice generic support card for great nature. Then the second support card is this triple R grade 2 Lop Daughter, and its ability is Auto Vanguard and Rearguard Circle. When placed, costs counter plus 1. Put the top card of your deck into the drop zone and perform one of the effects below depending on the card's type. Normal unit, call that card to the Rearguard Circle. Trigger unit, this unit gets power plus 15k until the end of turn. So this is also very similar to an already existing lottery effect, because this skill is somewhat flipped upside down to what the old Isabelle does. Because the old Isabelle, if you hit a normal unit, she will gain 15k, and if you have hit a trigger unit, then you can add that card to your hand. This is the other way around, but instead of adding it to your hand, you call to the Rearguard Circle. And because it works on a normal unit, you actually don't mind that it immediately calls that normal unit to the Rearguard Circle, as it probably is a really good card to be offensive about. And if you do this on turn 2, you could potentially hit a grade 3 unit. And Isabelle, the old Isabelle, has a rearguard effect, and the new Isabelle also has a rearguard effect. So if you hit one of those Isabelles of this effect, that's actually not that bad, because you could get some extra value immediately off that card as well. So there's definitely some interesting merits to this card, and it's overall a pretty solid value. It gets you either a +1 onto the field, or it could be a solid 24k attacker. And if this is your Vanguard, a 24k attacker that early on probably will deal damage. And if you run crits, you could definitely amp up the amount of damage very, very effectively. Now, with those two support cards out of the way, let's take a look at the new Isabelle, which hopefully will change the Isabelle deck that we already got and crank it all the way up to 11. So let's see if that's gonna happen with the new version. And of course, the new version is the brand new VR grade 3 Sage Saint Mentor of Black Liqueur, or Liqueur, how that is pronounced, Isabelle. And her abilities are plenty. Her first effect is Continuous Vanguard Circle. If your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 or greater, you perform both of the effects for perform one of the effects. This is identical to the previous Isabelle. So no matter if you sit on the old Isabelle or on this Isabelle, if your opponent is grade 3, all your lottery effects will gain both effects. This is nice for pure consistency's sake, because the old Isabelle deck, you run the Isabelle, but you also run some other grade 3 besides it. Probably Leopold in most cases, because that's also a really solid grade 3 to sit on. But the only difference is that if you don't sit on Isabelle, you don't get the full effect of your lottery cards. And the more and more lottery cards are going to be released, the more important that aspect is going to be. So having both grade 3s with the skill is actually pretty nice. The only downside, of course, is that it's reliant on your opponent being grade 3. So it's relatively slow, but there is some workaround here, which we're going to go into that. And that has to do with her following skills. Her second ability is Auto and Vanguard the Vanguard Circle. When placed, look at the free cards from the top of your deck and put them on the top of your deck in any order. So this is a Oracle Think Tank effect in Great Nature. You get to manipulate the top card of your deck. This is really good for several things. First off, in a generic sense, it allows you to stack triggers, just like what Oracle Think Tank does. So that's already a pretty good effect. Any clan would definitely like an effect such as this on whatever boss unit or a main key unit as an added effect like this is. So this is pretty good. But in Great Nature, you get the added bonus for the fact that you now can set up all your lottery effects, because you now know the next top 3 card. So you know exactly what you're going to mill for the next 3 mill effects. So even if you do not get both effects off because your opponent is sitting on grade 2, you can use this effect to basically get the skill version that you need to put out the most value that you want. And because you also know the top 3, you can even synergize this with something like a Binoculars Tiger or the grade 1 we just discussed, because you can set them up that they're gonna draw the card and you immediately know which card you're also going to draw. So you have more control over all those effects. So this is something you shouldn't write off of this card. This is a extremely powerful skills in whatever scenario. You can set up your lottery mechanics, you can set up your drive checks, you could potentially just set up your defensive checks, because you can set up the first next to twin drive and then set a defensive heal on the third one if you're deciding to not resolve any of your lottery effects because maybe you don't have the resources or the scenario doesn't really give you the room or the option to actually use that effects. So there is definitely a lot of flexibility to this card for that effect alone. But we have a third effect which makes a lot of interesting plays possible, because her main Vanguard skill is Act on Vanguard Circle once per turn, cost counter +1. Choose an auto ability with, when placed, of your units and activate it. If your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 or greater, all of your front row units get power plus 10k until the end of turn. Cost and conditions of that auto cannot be ignored. So basically what this does is allows you to reload an on-place effect from any of your units and then use that effect again. But you still need to pay for either Counter Blast or Soul Blast or discard effect, and also that unit needs to be on the correct circle. So they all are rearguard skills. So you cannot have a Vanguard Circle unit like a Leopold on the rearguard circle and then forcefully activate this on-place effects. That's not gonna happen. So sadly, no Leopold, no Hemscase, it's just pure rearguard effects. Even though that might be the case, this is actually pretty good, because a lot of your lottery effects have on-place effects. The previous 2 support cards for Isabelle had an on-place effect. Also, the grade 2 now, Lap Daughter, has an on-place effect. We can reuse those effects without needing to either have another copy in our hand or even use that copy from hand. So it saves a card from hand. So it's basically a soft plus to some extent, but also not really, because you still need to pay for the resources. But this Counter Blast can somewhat say that's equal to a draw 1 within most clans. What's also pretty interesting is that in the previous build we had a parrot, I believe, that has an effect that on place you could Soul Blast 1 to bounce a card. You use that to bounce back your on place effects so you could use them again. Now Isabelle basically does the exact same thing, but then for a Counter Blast, and you don't have to replay it from hand, you can just immediately forcefully activate. So you can run the parrot together with this Isabelle, and now you can say, alright, I have enough soul, or I have enough Counter Blast, so either one of those effects I'm gonna resolve because I have the room to pay for those resources with that effect. So it at least gives you more value behind and more options behind all your skills, and the added bonus is if your opponent is grade 3, it gives your front row plus 10k, and because you're an Excel deck, that's pretty nice. But of course there are some issues with this card which a lot of people have been pointing out. The main issue is that this card is relatively slow. Most of its effects, like you get both of the lottery effects as well as the 10k power, relies on your opponent being grade 3, so you're probably already suffered the full blunt of your opponent's side of the field before you actually can do some stuff. And that is true. It is relatively slow in the old Isabelle's. It has the same problems. And also, there is one more problem here. The once per turn Vanguard's X skill states specifically when placed effects. Auto skills with when placed. That ushers a problem here because that writing, or the way that those skills are written, is only been a thing with the reboot. When placed isn't a thing in skill text before the reboot. All the old era cards and the G era cards stated in the ballpark of when this unit is placed. So it's not the same, meaning it won't activate those effects. And so this card will only work with the new Viera cards and also with the upcoming auto unplace effects and whatever they're going to release afterwards. So keep that in mind, this thing won't really work with premium and anything that came before it, because it just doesn't work with how those skills are written, because it very specifically asks for when placed, and those cards don't have that skill text. Now, with that said, I do still believe that this card is actually really, really good for the Isabelle Great Nature deck, for a couple of reasons. First off, I already explained, you can now run both Isabelles, and both have the important continuous Vanguard circle skill, so you cannot miswrite. And ideally, you want to be sitting on this Isabelle, because this also has a Vanguard specific skill, but both Isabelles have a rearguard skill. So you don't mind calling them to the rearguard circle as well, because you get their value off. And that's what I meant with the grade 2 Lap daughter, because if that skill forcefully calls you a grade 3 early game, you still get value behind those things. And ideally you want to have the old Isabelle, because that costs a soul blast, so your opponent cannot damage deny you, so you can still use those skills. So there is some early high roll potential. But let's go into the actual interesting part for this Isabelle, which I think some people overlooked. Her ability to forcefully use when place effects can be super costly if we look at the other lottery effects, because you first need to pay a counterblast, and then you need to pay whatever resource comes afterwards, and that can either be another soul blast, another counterblast, or a counterblast and soul blast if you use the Hemske rifle, which has a really good unplace effect. So you might think that's not really worth it, and that can be the case in some scenarios, but then again, we had the Toucan or the Parrot that did the exact same thing, but then for a soul blast, and soul was a pretty hefty resource at the time, but we still used that engine, so why not pay the counterblast? But that's not what I really want to refer here. What I think is really powerful here is the fact that you can use Isabelle as a write target, so you can write it on your Vanguard circle, use her unplace effects to check the top 3 cards, then set all your things active for whatever mills effect you're gonna have. Use those effects, get the mills off, and then after you resolve all those effects, you can use her act ability to not reload one of those rearguards effects, but actually her own effect, because it states one of your units, so you can choose your Vanguard. So you can choose herself to check once again the top 3 and have even more control over all your mill effects. You can either set up for your battle phase skills like the Tigers or your grade 1 Bessem Ringtail to have more control over that, or as I explained, get more control over your drive checks and damage checks. So being able to either check the top 3 or top 6 cards, that's really powerful. You can just do that turn after turn for how many times you want to do, or you can even use it to forcefully activate the other Isabelle, because Counterblast, Soul Blast to resolve her skill to give her either 15k or add a card to hand, or maybe give her 15k and adding a card to hand is really good. And then, of course, if you go into the late game, given your entire front row and that extra 10k power, and then use something like Binoculars Tiger, then also use the grade 1 Bessem Ringtail to give another 5k, you can start to push out a lot of power while also drawing a lot of cards and gaining a lot of control over your deck, because you can still keep manipulating the top amount of cards in your deck. So Isabelle, on paper, is relatively slow. I'm not gonna argue around that fact. It's a fact. She's relatively slow to what we've seen with other cards can do. But if you can keep the ball rolling and you can start doing all the shenanigans you want to do, this deck can be really consistent and very powerful because of the amount of value you can accumulate over all your lottery skills, and the fact that she can manipulate the top 3 or potentially top 6 cards could somewhat combat the fact that you don't always get both your lottery effects in the early game. Because if you can just manipulate the top deck for the precise effect that you want, then that's almost as powerful as just getting both effects. Because the only reason why you want to have both effects is that you aren't reliant on RNG to get the effect that you want. If you can just set up for what you want, you don't really mind. Because if you have a Binoculars Tiger onto the board and your opponent has an empty field, what do you care that you are going to retire one of their units? Yes, the extra 5k power might be nice, but mainly maybe you just want to get the draw because the power in the early game doesn't really mean anything if your opponent is just going to say no guard. So there are definitely some merits here that maybe some people overlooked, but who knows? Maybe the next VR for Great Nature, Big Belly, will change this up around. Because what we learned so far is that Big Belly is gonna be revealed next Friday. And they hinted to a little known fact that Big Belly will be played like the old Great Nature style. But what they mean with that, I have no clue. Would they mean it's go back to their older roots, like way back? Or do they mean it's gonna be more like the combo heavy playstyle with pumping power and going for something like a success rate that we've seen with the actual Giera Big Belly deck? What they actually mean with that is pure speculation from this point onward. But with that said, let me know in the comments down below what you guys think of these new cards for Great Nature. Do you think this new Isabelle is really interesting for the already existing Isabelle deck? Are you disappointed that they have the grade 3 restriction on top of it? Or do you think there's actually a lot of value behind her skill and it just takes a little bit more in-depth looking about how you can change these skills and get the most value or the most bang for your buck? Let me know all your thoughts in the comments section down below. As always, this video has been brought to you by our lovely patrons over at patreon.com/VanguardInsider. You guys are amazing. If you do want to support the channel or everything that's happening on the channel, you can simply do that by going over to patreon.com/VanguardInsider and become a Patreon today. But with that said, I'm Mr. Time Leap, and I see you guys in the next one.